Today we're doing PCIe bandwidth testing, so we're looking at the generational impact on the RTX 4090 when you use PCIe Gen 3 versus PCIe Gen 4. Technically, we also ran it with the motherboard set to Gen 5, but Generation 5 PCIe is not supported by the RTX 4090, so it doesn't do anything. We threw it in there anyway though, because we knew people would ask. So really this is 3 versus 4. There's a little bit more nuance to this where you can start to derive some usefulness when you also scale 8 lanes versus 16 lanes, for example, between the two, because PCIe Gen 4 by 8 is the same as PCIe Gen 3 by 16 for the most part. They're about the same bandwidth. So let's get into the testing today. It's gonna be a really simple one, and we'll see how it scales. Before that, this video is brought to you by Montech's Sky1 Lite PC case. The Sky1 Lite is Montech's high airflow case with ventilated front panel, included fans, and RGB LED accents. The Sky1 Lite is a compact mid-tower case for ATX builds, and the ARGB LED Quick Connect on the front panel makes it easy to maintain the case without all of the cables. Dust filters are strategically placed, and there's basic cable management features while still maintaining a competitive price. Learn more at the link in the description below. First up, some background. So we did a lot of test passes here. Normally we do a minimum of 4, and then we multiply that depending on sort of the level of accuracy we need. And when you're looking at the same device and you're only changing the PCIe generation, there's a possibility that you run the numbers really close together and need that extra set of sort of accuracy or data resolution to get the numbers that you want to actually get, to be able to say this is a real difference and not just variance. So we did more test passes than normally. Now PCIe specs, there's a couple of layers of support that have to happen. And when you're talking about PCIe generational versioning for, there's Vaseline on this card, for which motherboard basically to drop it into at sort of the lowest possible end, really what you care about is the realized performance or the actual in-game or rendering performance or whatever it may be, because the theoretical maximum throughput is different from the actualized throughput. So you have to have support for the PCIe generation you want to use at the CPU level, if you look at a CPU block diagram, for example. And then it's got to pull maybe 16 lanes, for example, down to PEG1, which is the first PCIe slot typically for graphics support. And that's how your generation is dictated at the CPU and the platform level, that'd be the motherboard. If you're running lanes that are fed from the chipset, which is uncommon these days but possible, for NVIDIA, you need by 8, so you need 8 lanes. Can't do it on by 4 officially anyway. And those 8 lanes are probably going to be a lower generation of PCIe than what you're getting off the CPU. Plus you've got DMI or additional overhead basically between the CPU and the chipset anyway. But this is a relatively uncommon thing, so we're not going to be testing for that because Crossfire and SLI are dead. Not even basically, just actually. The final layer of support is the video card has to support it. So NVIDIA's RTX 4090 is on PCIe Gen 4. Now, this isn't actually necessarily a bad thing if the card cannot utilize PCIe Gen 5 in a meaningful way. So remember, with interfaces and protocols, you're typically limited by the device before the interface itself, unless you're running a much newer device on a much older interface. A great example of this would be back when SATA hard drives were the fastest thing you could get, SSDs weren't out yet, and you might cap out at maybe, say, 200 megabytes per second or whatever for a particular year of hard drive, while the interface itself could run closer to 550. So the interface was never a concern up until the devices got fast enough, obviously. And that's true for PCIe as well, where Gen 5, maybe it doesn't really matter for this. We won't really know formally, but we can get a good idea for how much Gen 3 versus Gen 4 matters. So that's the theoretical speed side of things versus actualized, and we can test theoretical, we'll show you that. And then the last thing to know is that PCIe generation becomes a lot more relevant on devices where they decide to cut down the lane count to say by 8. So if you're running 8 lanes to say an ARC A580 or whatever it was that's not out yet, or you're running 8 lanes to an AMD 6500 XT, now if you go from PCIe Gen 4 to PCIe Gen 3 by 8, you are really limiting your maximum possible throughput, both theoretical and actualized, shown in test data we've published in the past, where because PCIe Gen 4 by 8 versus PCIe Gen 3 by 8 is a 2x change, that's where you start to really lose on performance. That in this case it won't matter because it's all by 16. Gen 4. Here's a quick image just to show you the max theoretical bandwidth to get everyone up to speed. So technically, PCIe Gen 7 is planned for 2025 ratification. That doesn't mean you'll see it on boards necessarily. Probably you'll start to see at least rumors of it, but that's the plan. Gen 6 is introduced. I think it's been ratified, or at least parts of it have been ratified, but it's not on boards yet. And then Gen 5, which was introduced in 2019, is now on boards. So if you look at the transfer rate per lane, or actually it's even easier if you look at the throughput per Wikipedia by 16, Gen 5 can go approaching 64 gigabytes per second. Gen 4 by 16 is about 32 gigabytes per second. You see it's a pretty clean halving. You go down to Gen 3, you're at 16 gigabytes per second. So that is the theoretical max throughput of the interface itself. Whether or not the card utilizes that depends on the card. Okay, let's get into the first set of tests. This one is the PCIe bandwidth test. So using the 3D Mark PCIe bandwidth test, we're able to rapidly determine the maximum theoretical throughput of the PCIe slot, and this will not necessarily materialize in equivalent deltas in gaming or real applications unless they directly mirror this synthetic workload. But we haven't encountered anything that behaves the same way as the bandwidth test does in real life. Doesn't mean it's not out there, it just means we're not aware of it. And if you are, please tell us what that is so we can test it next time. Here's the chart. With the motherboard configured to Gen 5, the results is the same as Gen 4. That's because the card doesn't support PCIe Gen 5. The maximum theoretical throughput is 25.5 gigabytes per second here, with the Gen 3 result dropping nearly in half to 13 gigabytes per second. You can see there's some overhead there, because actual Gen 3 by 16 would be closer to 16 gigabytes per second. Gen 2 drops another half down to 6.7 gigabytes per second, and these results make sense and they align roughly with some overhead with the spec for PCIe. The most important thing with this test, other than just showing you that, yes, theoretically you can produce a difference, is that the toggle we're using in BIOS works. So that's important. So the way to test for this type of thing without switching the whole rest of the system, which would invalidate the testing, is basically to use built-in toggles in BIOS to drop down the PCIe generation. This test shows that those locks are in fact functioning properly, and it's not just for show. So it tells us that the testing approach we're taking is accurate. All right, let's get into the gaming results. So Total Warhammer gives us a heavy load with DX11, which isn't as close to the metal. The PCIe Gen 4 results ran at 124.9 to 125.4 FPS average, with Gen 3 at 122.5 average. Now, top to bottom, that's a maximum theoretical advantage of 2.4% on Gen 4. Variance is about 0.5% here. 1440p is more interesting. Here, the best result was 236.6 FPS average, with the worst at 227.4 FPS average on PCIe Gen 3. The best result leads PCIe Gen 3 by 4%. With the original test data, it's just another set of passes, mind you, but conducted a week earlier, leading at 3.6%. So that's more noteworthy than we saw at 4K. 1080p widens that gap to a really interesting extreme. In this one, we saw the PCIe Gen 4 result placing at 315 to 318 FPS average. That's reasonable variance at this frame rate. The PCIe Gen 3 result, though, was outside of variance at 277 FPS average. That allows the Gen 4 results a massive lead comparatively of about 15%, to a point where it's actually a big chunk of the GPU's maximum performance, and also a gigantic red flag to us that we need to retest. So we reran these tests on 2 different test benches that are identical for performance, and ultimately we confirmed the findings. As a sanity check, and because it's good lab practice, we called NVIDIA and requested that it have its own performance lab look into the results. It's currently queued to do so, and we're waiting for those to come back. For now, though, the best guess that GN and NVIDIA's team member just sort of unofficially have is that we found potentially a hole in driver optimization. It may be a PCIe bandwidth behavior, but it's probably more likely that this is a combination of the PCIe bandwidth with driver behavior. Regardless, this is an outlier, but it's an interesting one. We'd have to test probably hundreds of games to reliably find more of these types of results. It's something that could happen, it's just there's no real predictable way to make it happen. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next at 4K. This had us at 202 FPS average with Gen 4. It validated on both sets of stock passes. The PCIe Gen 3 result dropped to 198 FPS average, allowing a maximum advantage of 1.7% on PCIe Gen 4. In the very least, the consistency of lows here is impressive. We're feeling good about our testing methodology at this point, given the tightness of those results, but for PCIe generation differences, it's not that exciting. At 1440p, we're seeing similar results. The two Gen 4 tests ran at 241 to 242 FPS average with a maximum advantage of 0.5%. That's variance, so it's irrelevant. The lows are within variance as well. Final Fantasy XIV at 4K produced a range of 214 to 215 FPS average on Gen 4 results, with Gen 3 at 208. So there's a maximum improvement in this set of tests of 3.3%. Rainbow Six Siege at 4K and on DX11 ran at 355 to 356 FPS average with Gen 4 datasets, even with a week between the tests, and Gen 3 ran at 350 FPS average. That's outside the expected variance, which is actually really small in this game as indicated by the bars, and the maximum uplift is 1.5%. At 1440p, technically the range widened here, but not a meaningful amount versus the 1.5% result previously. We're at 1.96% maximum uplift now. And at 1080p, we're seeing less than a 1% swing in Rainbow Six Siege, but we're also running 1080p on an RTX 4090, so that's part of why. We threw Strange Brigade in here using Vulkan at 1080p as well, just to throw another extreme into the mix of a different API at a low resolution, just to see if any unique behaviors emerged. They didn't. The maximum delta we observed was 1.3%. So that's it for the PCIe bandwidth testing. This is pretty much the same we see every generation, where with the newest card on the newest version of PCIe versus the previous version, it's about a 1 to 3% range. So that's what we're seeing. There was one really unique and interesting outlier, and that was Total War Warhammer 3, where at 1080p specifically and only for that bench, and with the settings we used, with DirectX 11, with the battle benchmark, we saw a 15% range, and that was reproducible multiple times with two different test benches. And then we also called NVIDIA to sort of set in motion a performance lab evaluation of it to try and get an answer for why that's specifically happening. And when we get that answer, we'll put it in the hardware news as just an update for educational purposes of, okay, this is a behavior, but why? That, though, is truly an outlier. And like we said earlier, you'd have to test hundreds of games to really find those and start to establish a pattern for when they happen. So overall, you don't need to worry about PCIe bandwidth too much here. It's a couple percent range maximally. And realistically, if you're spending $1,600 on a video card, not too many of you, although there will be some, will be slotting that card into an old enough system that its max PCIe support is Gen 3. So for the most part, kind of a non-issue. But if you're looking at, say, a by 8 Gen 4 interface, you can compare those results to by 16 Gen 3, and you're looking at a 1 to 4% range or so, maybe with occasional outliers that we can't really account for. But that's it. It's very simple and straightforward for this one. Check back for more. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly. And we have more follow-up testing we're doing on the CPUs and the GPUs that all just came out. Those follow-ups, a lot of them will be shorter like this one and very focused on just strictly what we're talking about for the follow-up. So subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.